He stood under the spotlight, the perfect husband, the perfect CEO, until that night, in front of millions watching live. He looked at his pregnant wife and said, "Grace and I are parting ways." And just like that, he replaced her. Publicly, cruelly. The internet called it the boldest breakup in tech history. But what no one knew was that Grace's brother was quietly watching from the shadows, and he was about to become Ethan's worst nightmare. Because sometimes karma doesn't whisper, it goes viral. Stay with us. This story will break your heart and heal it again. If it moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because this isn't just drama. It's justice served live. The night shimmered with gold, light, and ambition. From the balcony of the Seattle Grand Pavilion, the skyline glittered like a trophy cabinet filled with Ethan Cole's victories. Below, limousines curved toward the red-carpeted entrance, where flashes from the media created a storm of artificial lightning. Inside, 1,000 guests from the world of technology and finance gathered to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Vertex Systems, the company Ethan had built from a forgotten garage into a global empire. To the world, he was a visionary. To his board, he was a king. And tonight, he planned to make that power feel eternal. Grace Bennett, his wife of 10 years, stood near the bar, clutching a crystal glass of sparkling water. She was 34, radiant yet understated, the kind of beauty that came not from effort, but from stillness. A pale blue silk dress draped over her slender frame, concealing the gentle curve of a pregnancy she had not yet announced. Her heart was full, fragile, and hopeful. Three emotions that no longer belonged in Ethan's world. He had promised this night would be about celebration, about them. Instead, something inside her whispered danger. At the center of the ballroom, Ethan raised his glass, smiling the smile that had sold investors on billion-dollar dreams. Cameras turned toward him, capturing every movement for the live broadcast. His company's logo glowed behind him like a sun. Grace felt the first tremor of dread when he took Lila Torres's hand, his new head of public relations, and drew her to the stage beside him. The woman's dress gleamed in sequined silver, reflecting the light like shattered glass. Ethan's voice carried effortlessly through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends, partners, and believers," he began, his tone smooth as champagne. "Tonight we celebrate not only the success of Vertex Systems, but the evolution of vision itself. 10 years ago, I was just a man with a dream. Tonight, I stand before you as proof that when you refuse to settle for comfort, you make history." Grace's fingers tightened around her glass. She had heard that line before in their kitchen when she begged him to take a break, to remember who he was before the fame. He had smiled then too, the same way he was smiling now. The applause roared, cameras flashed, Ethan waited, his gaze sweeping over the crowd until it found hers. For a brief moment, the husband she once loved looked back at her. Then he said the words that would destroy her world. "Change," he declared, "is the essence of progress. And sometimes that change begins at home." The laughter in the room quieted. A collective breath held still. Ethan continued, his voice unshaken. "Tonight, I want to be transparent with those who have believed in me. Grace and I have decided to part ways. This will be a new chapter. For me, for Vertex, and for the future we're building together." The room froze. Grace could not move, could not breathe. Behind her, someone gasped. Another whispered, "A public divorce?" Lila stepped closer to Ethan, sliding her hand through his arm. The gesture was deliberate, triumphant. "And as I begin this new era," Ethan said, his voice now alive with adrenaline, "I'm proud to introduce my new partner, both in business and in life, Lila Torres." There was no applause this time, only shock. Grace's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The sound was swallowed by the silence. Every eye turned to her. Her face, pale as porcelain, reflected on 100 phone screens as guests began recording what they knew would be tomorrow's headline. CEO announces public divorce during live broadcast. She turned and walked away before the cameras could capture the first tear. Outside, the rain had begun, a thin, cold mist that seemed to dissolve the city lights into streaks of sorrow. The limousine driver opened the door for her, but she waved him off. She walked instead, heels clicking on wet pavement, one hand pressed to her stomach. Inside her, the faint promise of life fluttered weakly, as if frightened by the violence of humiliation. Behind her, inside the ballroom, Ethan basked in the false glow of applause. Lila leaned close, whispering, "That was bold, even for you." Ethan smiled, the smile of a man convinced that power was invincible. "Sometimes," he said, "you have to burn the past to own the future." But as he raised his champagne to the crowd, his eyes flicked once more toward the door Grace had exited. A shadow crossed his expression, gone before he could name it. Regret, perhaps, or the ghost of conscience. The cameras never caught it. Grace reached the quiet of their penthouse long after midnight. The rain followed her, tapping the windows like soft fingers. The city below glowed indifferent. She moved through rooms that smelled of luxury and emptiness. On the kitchen counter lay a bouquet of white orchids with a card, "For the next chapter." Her breath came shallow. The dizziness started in her chest, spreading outward. She gripped the marble island, whispering, "No, please." The pain doubled her over. She sank to the floor, the tiles cool beneath her cheek, her vision dimming. The silence broke only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her own heart slowing. In that moment, everything she had ever given, her love, her loyalty, her faith, slipped away with the life inside her. When she opened her eyes again, she was in a hospital room bathed in sterile light. A nurse stood beside her, in pity softening her face. "You're going to be all right, Mrs. Cole," she said gently. "But you lost the baby." Grace stared at the ceiling, its whiteness stretching infinite. Outside the window, the headlines were already spreading. "Power couple no more. Vertex CEO ends marriage live on stage." She closed her eyes and whispered his name once, softly, like a prayer that had already been denied. And far across the city, in a penthouse filled with laughter and new beginnings, Ethan Cole, the man who had everything, felt a brief, inexplicable chill. He brushed it off, raising another glass to his reflection. He did not yet know that the collapse had already begun. The rain hadn't stopped since the gala. Seattle's glitter was washed into gray silence. Grace Bennett, no longer Grace Cole, watched it from her hospital window, hollow-eyed and wordless. The doctor's voice still echoed in her head. "You lost the baby." The news of her husband's public humiliation of her had gone viral. She was no longer a woman, but a headline. When she was discharged, she didn't go home. The penthouse was a mausoleum of betrayal. She drove south to her brother Daniel's vineyard in Oregon. He met her at the gate, expression carved from stone. Daniel Bennett was calm, sharp, and cold. The kind of man who never forgot an offense. When she told him what Ethan had done, he didn't ask for details. "You should have called sooner," he said simply. That night, while Grace tried to sleep, Daniel began working. He traced Vertex Systems' financial structure, its debt, its investors, its vulnerabilities. Ethan Cole had built an empire of glass. Daniel intended to shatter it. Ethan, meanwhile, lived in triumph. The public divorce had made him infamous, but his arrogance disguised the rot beneath. Vertex Systems was preparing to launch its revolutionary AI platform, Nexus. His new partner, Lila Torres, made sure every camera stayed on them. "You're a legend," she told him. "People envy your freedom." Freedom, he thought, had never felt so fragile. Weeks passed. Grace began healing amid the quiet rhythm of the vineyard. She painted, walked through the Pyrenees, and tried to believe peace was possible. But she didn't know that her brother was orchestrating something far beyond comfort. Through a network of shell corporations, Daniel, under Northbridge Capital, started buying up Vertex's debt, quietly, strategically. In Seattle, Ethan noticed strange fluctuations in his company's stock. His CFO, Robert Kane, looked pale when he explained. "Someone's accumulating a controlling interest through subsidiaries. We're tracking it, but it's fast." Ethan scoffed. "Corporate raiders. Handle it." But every week the numbers crept higher. Grace's first art show opened in a Portland gallery. Her paintings, grief-made color, attracted quiet praise. Daniel attended, proud but distracted, stepping away often to answer his buzzing phone. "You did it," he told her that night. "You're standing again." She smiled. "You helped me." He kissed her forehead. "Always." But behind his calm eyes was the glint of vengeance nearing completion. In Seattle, Ethan's empire began to crumble. Suppliers withdrew. Investors vanished. Northbridge Capital's name appeared everywhere. He barely slept, pacing his penthouse like a trapped animal. "Who are they?" he demanded. Robert's answer came in a whisper. "They've crossed 51%. An emergency board meeting was called. The next morning, Ethan entered the boardroom, his temple of power, for the last time. At the head of the table sat a stranger, Alistair Finch, representing Northbridge. "Mr. Cole," he said, "this meeting is to confirm leadership transition." "Transition?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "You can't replace me." Finch gestured toward the door. "The new CEO is here." The doors opened. Daniel Bennett stepped inside. Ethan froze, color draining from his face. "You," Daniel's voice was calm, "you humiliated my sister in public. Now I'm taking everything you built on her pain." The vote was swift and unanimous. Ethan was removed from his own company in minutes. He tried to stand, to argue, but the room spun. His vision went black. He woke in a hospital bed, the beeping of a heart monitor echoing like a verdict. The nurse smiled gently. "You collapsed from shock, Mr. Cole. You're lucky." Lucky, the word felt obscene. No one came to visit. Lila had vanished. The headlines read, "Ethan Cole ousted by ex-wife's brother." He scrolled through the article until he reached the line that ended him. Vertex Systems appoints Daniel Bennett as CEO, ensuring a moral realignment. When he was released, his penthouse was empty. Lila was waiting by the door, suitcase in hand. "I can't be part of this, Ethan," she said softly. "My brand's tied to success." "So it was never about love." She smiled sadly. "It was about the idea of you." And then she left. Grace read the news the same morning Ethan collapsed. The headline made her hand tremble. "Public divorce comes full circle." She turned off the screen, heartbreaking not for her brother's victory, but for the man she once believed could change. Daniel returned to Oregon days later, quiet, victorious. "It's done," he said. Grace looked at him, unsure whether to thank him or fear him. "You didn't need to destroy him." Daniel met her gaze. "He destroyed himself. I just gave gravity a push." But that night alone, Grace cried, not out of grief for Ethan or pride in Daniel, but from the realization that vengeance never ended where you expected. In the months that followed, Vertex Systems flourished under Daniel's leadership. Investors praised his ethics, his composure, his brilliance. Grace resumed her life quietly, teaching art classes and avoiding the news. Yet sometimes when she painted late at night, she would remember Ethan's laugh, his flaws, his fire. One evening she told Daniel, "You won, but it doesn't feel like victory." He looked out at the vineyard, silent. Justice rarely does. Neither of them saw the next storm coming, the one that would test what remained of their souls. The news spread like wildfire across every network. Vertex CEO Ethan Cole collapses during hostile takeover. By mid-morning, his photograph, pale, unconscious, the outline of a hospital bed visible behind him, dominated every financial feed. The man who once seemed untouchable had fallen, and the world could not look away. At the vineyard in Oregon, Grace sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper folded in front of her. The print headline was almost surreal, the kind of story she would have read with detached curiosity if it hadn't been her life reflected in black ink. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee. Daniel entered, dressed in his usual calm precision. Dark sweater, pressed shirt, expression unreadable. "You've seen it," he said. "I have," she answered softly. "The whole country has." He poured himself a cup and sat opposite her, perfectly composed. "Then you know it's over. He can't touch you anymore." Grace looked up, her eyes glassy but firm. "What did you do, Daniel? How far did you go?" He met her gaze evenly. "I gave him what he earned, nothing more. That company was his life." "And you were his life once too," Daniel replied. "He threw you away in public, Grace. This was justice." She shook her head. "Justice isn't humiliation. It's not destruction." He leaned back, his voice soft but edged. "You still don't understand men like him. They only learn when something breaks. He built a tower on your back. I simply pulled the wrong brick." Grace stared at her brother. There was pride in his tone, but beneath it, she heard exhaustion, maybe even regret. "And now what?" she asked. "You've destroyed him. What does that make you?" Daniel's expression didn't change. It makes me your brother. It makes me someone who remembers what he did to you when the rest of the world applauded. Grace rose from the table, pushing her chair back. You didn't do it for me, she said quietly. You did it because it made you feel powerful. He didn't deny it. In Seattle, Ethan regained consciousness 2 days later. The room was dim except for the glow of monitors and the slow, rhythmic beep that reminded him he was still alive. His body felt hollow, his chest sore, his throat dry. A nurse smiled when she saw his eyes open. Welcome back, Mr. Cole, she said softly. You gave everyone quite a scare. Everyone? His voice came rough, disbelieving. Well, the world's been watching, she said, adjusting the monitor. You're all over the news. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment, he let the words sink in. He had wanted attention all his life, and now he had it in the worst possible way. When the nurse left, silence settled. He stared at the ceiling, memories colliding. The gala lights, Lila's smile, Grace walking out into the rain. The moment the world shifted from worship to judgment. The door opened quietly. Lila stood there, flawless as ever, but pale beneath the makeup. She carried a bouquet of white lilies, the kind publicists choose for sympathy photos. You look like hell, she said softly. Ethan gave a hoarse laugh. That's accurate. She placed the flowers on the nightstand, then stood awkwardly at the foot of his bed. They forced me out, she said. New leadership. Daniel Bennett. He says it's restructuring. Restructuring, Ethan echoed bitterly. He means erasing. Lila hesitated. I'm sorry, Ethan. I didn't know. He cut her off. Didn't know what? That the man I mocked for years was smarter than me? That the quiet brother of the woman I destroyed would be the one to finish me? She looked down. You're angry. I get it. No, he said after a moment. I'm not angry. Not anymore. That frightened her more than if he had shouted. She took a step closer. You can rebuild. You always do. He turned his head toward the window, the city beyond it gray and distant. Not this time. Lila opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. The silence between them was thick and final. She left without saying goodbye. Back at the vineyard, Grace walked the rows of vines, her boots pressing into the soft soil. The air smelled of rain and sap. She thought of Ethan, not as the man who had betrayed her, but as the man she once believed could change the world. Cynthia called that afternoon. Grace, everyone's talking about it. Your brother's being called a financial genius. You're part of history now. I don't want to be Grace replied, well, whether you like it or not, people see this as poetic justice. A public divorce, a CEO collapse. It's practically Shakespeare for the internet age. Grace winced at the words. It's not a story, Sin. It's a life. It's loss. Cynthia hesitated. You still care about him. Grace didn't answer, but silence was its own confession. Daniel's revenge had made him powerful in ways he hadn't expected. Overnight, he became the new face of Vertex Systems, praised for his calm leadership and vision. The company's value stabilized, investors returned, and journalists hailed him as the savior who had rescued innovation from ego. In interviews, Daniel's tone was measured. This isn't about revenge, he told one reporter. It's about restoring integrity. But at night, alone in his office overlooking the vineyard, he stared at the financial charts that now obeyed his hand and wondered if Grace had been right. Maybe it was about power after all. He had learned long ago that power was not loud. It was silent, deliberate, patient. The quiet war always won. Ethan's days in the hospital blurred into one another. He read headlines about his fall, about Daniel's takeover, about Grace's quiet disappearance from public life. Each story carved a little deeper into the hollow space inside him. When the doctors finally released him, he didn't return to his penthouse. It no longer felt like home. Instead, he rented a modest apartment overlooking the Sound. The view was beautiful and merciless. He tried to call Grace once, but her number was disconnected. He tried again through an old mutual friend, only to hear, "She doesn't want contact, Ethan. Let her be." He didn't argue. For the first time in his life, he understood what silence could do. Grace learned about Ethan's recovery from a headline, not from him. Former CEO leaves hospital in seclusion. No photos, no statements, just the faint echo of a man fading from relevance. She sat by the window that night, sketchbook in hand, drawing the shape of a city she once loved and could no longer bear to see. Daniel passed through the doorway, watching her quietly. "You could move on," he said. "I'm trying." "Then stop reading about him." She closed the sketchbook. "I'm not reading about him. I'm remembering what it cost to stop loving him." Daniel sighed, resting a hand on her shoulder. "He doesn't deserve your forgiveness." Grace looked up, eyes clear. "Maybe not, but forgiveness isn't for him." For the first time, Daniel had no answer. Late one night, while Daniel attended a conference call with his board, Grace wandered into his study. The screens glowed softly in the dark, filled with charts and numbers she didn't understand. But one document caught her eye, a portfolio labeled Northbridge Holdings, Complete Acquisition Summary. She scrolled through pages of contracts, mergers, and transfers. It was dizzying. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. This wasn't just justice, it was domination. She whispered to the empty room, "What have you done, Daniel?" The screens reflected her pale face back at her, multiplied in endless windows of power and debt. By dawn, Daniel returned to find her waiting in the kitchen. "You've seen it," he said quietly. "I have," she answered. "You didn't just take his company. You took everything tied to him. His patents, his networks, his investors." He poured coffee, calm as ever. "I secured our future." "No," she said, "you made us like him." Daniel looked at her with genuine pain. "I did this so you could live without fear." "I was never afraid of him," she whispered, "only of what hate can turn us into." He didn't respond. The quiet war between them had begun. The vineyard had never felt so tense. The air itself seemed to hum with something unsaid. Grace moved through the rooms as if afraid to disturb the silence. Daniel spent more time on his phone, his voice clipped and quiet, dealing with matters she wasn't allowed to hear. The balance between them, once gentle and familiar, had become brittle. One morning she found a courier envelope on the doorstep addressed to Ms. Grace Bennett. Inside was a glossy magazine. On the cover, the new titan, Daniel Bennett, the man who toppled a CEO. Below it, smaller headlines screamed, "Public divorce turned corporate war, sibling mastermind of the century." Grace sat on the porch staring at it until the letters blurred. When Daniel came out with his coffee, she held up the magazine. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked. He looked at the cover, unbothered. "That's what they do, Grace. They need a story. And we just give them one blow. You didn't just destroy him. You made us entertainment." Daniel lowered his voice. "You think they would have left you alone? The only way to end a public divorce is to rewrite the ending. Now they talk about me, not you. You're free." Grace's laugh was sharp and tired. "Free? I can't walk into a gallery without hearing whispers. They see me as the woman whose brother saved her, not the woman who survived on her own." Daniel's expression softened. "That's temporary. The noise fades." But as she turned to go back inside, she said quietly, "So does humanity, Daniel, if you keep treating people like chess pieces." He said nothing. He didn't need to. The war he had started was no longer just between him and Ethan. It was between justice and conscience, and Grace could feel it hollowing her brother out. In Seattle, Ethan Cole's world had shrunk to 4 rooms in the steady rhythm of his recovery. The doctor warned him to rest, but rest only left him alone with memory. The humiliation was everywhere. He couldn't open a business journal without seeing Daniel Bennett's face. The once mighty CEO was now a ghost haunting his own legacy. He sat by the window, watching ferries cross the Sound, his thoughts circling back to Grace. He imagined her in Oregon, safe but cold toward him, maybe even happy. He wanted to believe she was happy. Lila returned one afternoon uninvited. She looked shaken, a hint of desperation beneath her polished mask. "Ethan, we need to talk." He didn't stand. "What do you want, Lila?" "They're coming for me. Your new board, Daniel. He's reopening every contract I ever signed. They're calling it an ethics review. They'll ruin me." Ethan's tone was flat. "Maybe you earned that." She flinched. "You think I wanted any of this? You used me as much as I used you." "We were a brand, Ethan. A perfect illusion." He almost smiled. "Illusions collapse, Lila. That's the rule." She dropped her bag on the floor, voice trembling. Then help me. I can expose him. Your ex-wife's brother. I know things. Leverage, leaks, deals offshore. You don't have to forgive me, but you can fight him back. For the first time in months, Ethan's pulse quickened. Why come to me? Because you're the only one who hates him as much as I do. He looked out the window again, the gray sky reflected in his eyes. No, he said quietly. I don't hate him. I just finally understand him. Lila blinked. You're not serious? I'm done fighting ghosts. You should be too. Lila stared at him, realizing she was talking to a man she no longer recognized. The arrogance was gone, the fire replaced by something calmer, sadder, maybe even wiser. She left without another word. A week later, Grace drove into Portland for an art show she had promised to attend. The city's lights felt too bright, the noise too sharp after months of vineyard quiet. As she entered the gallery, whispers rippled through the crowd. Is that her? Someone murmured. The CEO's ex-wife. Grace smiled politely, pretending not to hear. She walked among the canvases, letting the colors steady her breathing. But as she turned a corner, she froze. A familiar voice, Lila Torres, was speaking to a group of investors near the bar. Grace's first instinct was to leave. But then Lila saw her, smiled faintly, and excused herself. She approached slowly, her heels clicking against the floor like warning shots. Grace Bennett, she said softly. You're even calmer in person than I imagined. Grace met her eyes. What do you want, Lila? Nothing, just curiosity. It's strange, isn't it? You and I, both casualties of the same man. Grace's tone stayed cool. I survived him. Can you say the same? Lila's smile wavered. Touché, but if you think your brother did you a favor, you're wrong. He's becoming worse than Ethan ever was. At least Ethan's arrogance was honest. Grace frowned. You don't know my brother. Oh, I do now, Lila said quietly. He's investigating me, pulling strings behind every media outlet. He doesn't protect you, Grace. He controls you. Grace turned away, unwilling to let the words in, but they lingered like a splinter. That night, she drove back to Oregon through the rain, Lila's warning echoing in her mind. Daniel was waiting when she arrived. You've been with reporters? He asked sharply. She blinked. No, I went to the show, that's all. I got a call from Portland Business Weekly. They're running a piece on me. Somehow they know things that were never public. She folded her arms. You're paranoid. He stepped closer. Did you speak to Lila Torres? Grace hesitated too long. Daniel's voice hardened. Grace. Yes, she said finally. I saw her. She came to me. His eyes narrowed. And what did she tell you? That you're losing yourself. That revenge has become your whole identity. For the first time, she saw anger flash in him. She's manipulating you. She wants to divide us. She doesn't need to, Grace said. You're doing that yourself. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. You think I wanted this? You think I enjoyed destroying him? I did it because you couldn't. Her voice broke. I never asked you to. They stood in silence, the storm outside pounding against the windows. Finally, Daniel spoke, quieter. You wouldn't have survived without me. Grace's answer came steady. Maybe. But you wouldn't have survived yourself without this war. Now it's all you have left. In Seattle, Ethan spent his evenings walking the waterfront. He wore a cap pulled low, unrecognized by the world that once cheered his name. One evening, he paused by a newspaper stand. On the front page, he saw Daniel's face again. Bennett expands empire with global partnership. He read the article twice, then whispered to himself, Power is a mirror. It shows us what we've become. Later that night, he opened his laptop and began typing an email. To Grace Bennett, subject. You don't owe me anything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I see it now, the cost of everything I built. Your brother won the war, but you were never my enemy. I'm sorry for every wound I made you carry. I hope you found peace, Ethan. He stared at the message for a long time, then pressed send. Grace read it the next morning. She didn't reply, but tears blurred the words. It was not absolution, but it was human, and that mattered. Later that day, she found Daniel in his office. It's time to stop, she said. The company's yours. The headlines are yours. Let it end. Daniel didn't look up. It's not that simple. Yes, it is. She stepped closer. You wanted to protect me. You did. But now you're becoming him. He lifted his gaze, and for the first time she saw how tired he looked. Maybe that's the price of winning. Grace shook her head. Then maybe winning isn't worth it. That night she wrote in her journal for the first time in months. Power begins with fear, grows through revenge, and ends in emptiness. When she closed the book, she whispered a quiet prayer, not for Ethan, not for Daniel, but for herself. The quiet war had consumed them all. But somewhere in the distance, she felt the faintest pulse of hope, like the heartbeat of a world still learning how to heal. The vineyard glowed beneath an early autumn sun, but inside the main house, the air was sharp with tension. Daniel Bennett had turned one of the sitting rooms into a command center, a sleek table covered in monitors, contracts, and quiet power. The man who once walked among the vines with a glass of wine now lived in conference calls and market updates. Grace noticed the change each day. His voice had grown clipped, his eyes darker. The gentleness she remembered from their childhood had been replaced by calculation. Grace watched from the doorway as he ended a call. Tokyo's in, he said to someone on the screen. Secure the partnership by Friday. I don't care what the offer costs. When the call ended, he leaned back, rubbing his temples. You sound tired, she said softly. Daniel didn't turn. You sound worried. I am. You've been running for months, Daniel. What are you chasing now? He smiled without warmth. Stability. The thing every empire needs after victory. Empires, she repeated quietly. That's the word Ethan used too. His gaze flicked to her, warning her not to push. But she did anyway. You took his company. You saved me. But you're not saving yourself. He stood and walked toward the window. You don't understand how fragile power is, Grace. The moment you stop moving, someone else takes your place. Then maybe it's not worth having. Daniel exhaled through his nose, as though patience were a language he'd forgotten. You think I enjoy this? I'm keeping everything intact so it doesn't collapse again. If I let my guard down, the vultures come. Grace crossed her arms. Maybe the vultures are already here. You're just feeding them yourself. He looked at her for a long moment, then walked past her out of the room. His silence felt heavier than anger. In Seattle, the Vertex Systems logo still shimmered across the tower that bore its name, but the people inside had changed. The building once pulsed with Ethan Cole's relentless energy, his charisma, his demands, his impossible standards. Now it operated with Daniel Bennett's quiet precision. Employees whispered that the new CEO was colder, less human, but frighteningly effective. The numbers proved it. Profits were up, investor confidence stable. And yet something in the culture had cracked. During a board meeting that Tuesday, Daniel sat at the head of the table while department heads presented quarterly data. Every report sounded flawless. That should have pleased him, but instead it made him uneasy. Perfection was a mask, and he knew masks well. Everything looks too clean, he said finally. What aren't you showing me? The heads exchanged nervous glances until Robert Kane, the CFO who had once served under Ethan, spoke up. There's nothing hidden, sir. Our metrics, Daniel interrupted. I'm not asking for metrics. I'm asking for truth. The room fell silent. Robert cleared his throat. Morale's down over there. All two saying, high turnover. People miss the old culture even with its flaws. Daniel's jaw tightened. The old culture was built on arrogance. Maybe, Robert said, meeting his eyes, but arrogance at least was alive. People believed they were part of something bigger. Now they're just afraid. The words hit harder than Daniel wanted to admit. He ended the meeting early. That night, Grace received another letter, anonymous, slipped under her studio door. The handwriting was careful, masculine. Your brother is becoming what he fought. You are the only one who can stop him before it's too late. No signature, no explanation, just that warning. She burned the letter in the fireplace, but the message stayed with her. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole lived quietly in a small apartment overlooking the bay. He kept no staff, no interviews, no entourage. Each morning he brewed his own coffee and read the financial pages that once chronicled his rise. It was strange to watch his name fade from relevance. Stranger still to realize he felt relief. For months, he had been seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Whitaker, who asked difficult questions and refused to let him deflect. She had an unnerving habit of silence that forced him to fill the space with honesty. One afternoon, she asked, "What do you miss most, Ethan, the company or the power?" He thought for a long moment. "Neither," he said finally. "I miss the feeling that what I built mattered to someone I loved." "Grace," he nodded. "She believed in me when there was nothing to believe in. I traded that for applause." Dr. Whitaker's voice was steady. "Then maybe you are not finished yet." He looked up. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes redemption isn't about getting back what you lost. It's about building something new from the ruins." He didn't respond, but that night he couldn't stop hearing her words. The next morning, he opened his old laptop and scrolled through archived files from Vertex. There, buried among years of data, he found something unfinished. Project Solace, a philanthropic platform Grace had once suggested, connecting underfunded schools with emerging tech donors. He'd dismissed it as a distraction back then. Now it looked like a second chance. Ethan started making calls, quiet ones, not for investors, but for collaborators, old engineers, teachers, nonprofit directors. When he told them what he wanted, most laughed in disbelief, but a few didn't. They remembered the man who once cared before the world taught him to worship mirrors. By the end of the week, he had rented a small office above a bookstore. A new beginning, fragile but real. Back in Oregon, Grace was painting late when Daniel came in, phone in hand. "We need to talk," he said. She set down her brush. "About?" "Someone's leaking internal documents, confidential memos, financial summaries. The media's spinning it as corporate hypocrisy, calling me the new tyrant of tech." Grace's heart sank. "Then stop hiding behind power. Give an interview. Be honest for once." He shook his head. "Honesty doesn't survive headlines." "Neither does your soul," she said. He gave a small, humorless laugh. "You're starting to sound like him." "Who?" "Ethan." The word landed like a slap. Grace looked at him, hurt. "Maybe because he finally learned what you haven't. That power isn't protection." Daniel's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. He turned and walked out, leaving her alone with the smell of turpentine and the echo of what she feared most, that Daniel's empire was beginning to crack from within. A week later, she received a voicemail. The voice was hesitant, low, unmistakable. "Grace, it's Ethan. I know I shouldn't call. I just wanted to say thank you for surviving me. I'm trying to be someone better now. I thought you should know." She sat in the quiet after the message ended, tears slipping down her face. He sounded different, slower, humble, the sound of a man no longer performing. For the first time, she didn't feel anger. She felt something simpler, cleaner. Pity, maybe, or grace. Daniel's public image began to shift. The press once called him a visionary. Now they called him ruthless. Anonymous reports accused him of exploiting the same loopholes Ethan had once used. It didn't matter whether they were true, the perception was poison. During a live interview meant to clear his name, a journalist asked, "Do you think you've become what you destroyed?" Daniel hesitated, just a fraction of a second. It was enough. The clip went viral. That night, Grace found him in his study, staring at the television replay. The expression on his face was not anger, but something worse, fear. She said quietly, "You can still stop." He didn't look at her. "It's too late to stop. The only thing left is to win." "But at what cost?" Daniel closed his eyes. "Whatever it takes." Grace realized then that her brother's war had shifted from justice to obsession, and the cracks in his empire were no longer just financial, they were moral, and they were spreading fast. The autumn wind carried the first chill of winter across the vineyard. Rows of vines stood stripped bare, black branches twisting toward a pale sky. Inside, the warmth of Daniel's house felt forced, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Grace could sense the fracture deepening. Power had made her brother restless, and restlessness had turned to fear. He worked in silence for hours, fielding calls from lawyers, strategists, and publicists. His words were short, clipped. Every time Grace passed his office, she heard him pacing. His empire, the one built on revenge, was beginning to tremble. One evening, she brought him dinner, setting the plate beside his laptop. You need to eat, she said gently. He didn't look up. I will. You've said that for 3 nights. I'm fine. She watched him scan another report. You're not fine. The papers are tearing you apart. You can't control every story. Daniel's eyes flicked to hers, the calm of a man balancing on a knife's edge. Control is the only thing keeping us safe. Do you think the world would hesitate to destroy me if they could? Grace folded her arms. You talk like the world's the enemy. Maybe the only enemy left is the one you made in the mirror. He exhaled sharply, pushing back from the desk. You don't understand what it's like to hold something in this fragile. One mistake, one wrong move, and everything collapses. Her voice softened. Then maybe it deserves to. Daniel's gaze lingered on her. There was love in his eyes still, but buried under exhaustion and pride. You sound like him, he said quietly. Grace frowned. Who? Ethan. He said something similar before he lost everything. She stepped closer, speaking almost in a whisper. And look what it took for him to change. Don't wait for your own collapse to find your soul again. For the first time, Daniel looked afraid. Meanwhile, Ethan's small office above the bookstore had become a modest hive of purpose. Project Solace was no longer just an idea. It was alive. 2 engineers from his old company worked with it now, along with a handful of volunteers. The mission was simple: connect underfunded schools with unused technology from larger corporations. What had once been his symbol of dominance, the machinery of wealth, was now being repurposed for something quietly redemptive. He didn't advertise. He didn't give interviews. Word spread slowly, almost accidentally, through teachers' forums and small news blogs. Donations began trickling in. A modest article appeared in a local paper. Disgraced CEO funds tech for kids. Ethan smiled at the headline. It wasn't flattering, but it was true. For once, truth felt like enough. Late one evening while reviewing budgets, he came across an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read simply, "From Oregon." Inside was a single line. I hope you really mean it this time. Gee. He read it twice, then leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, peace didn't feel impossible. Across the state, Daniel's world continued to unravel. The press had shifted from fascination to fury. Leaks exposed questionable offshore accounts, insider dealings, and alleged manipulation of markets. None of it was illegal, but it painted him as everything he claimed to fight. His communications director resigned. Board members stopped returning calls. Investors began demanding audits. Daniel barely slept. Each morning he stared into the mirror, adjusting his tie as if armor could hide the panic in his eyes. During one tense board session, Robert Kane, the same CFO who had once warned Ethan, spoke up. Sir, you should consider stepping back. Temporarily. Let the heat fade. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's exactly what they want. With respect, Robert had said gently, maybe what they want is transparency. You can't lead a company that's bleeding trust. Daniel slammed his fist against the table, startling everyone. I rebuilt this company from ashes. None of you would have jobs without me. The silence that followed was thick with unease. Grace watched the coverage from the living room, horror and sorrow mixing in her chest. She wanted to call Daniel, to tell him to stop fighting shadows, but she knew he wouldn't listen. Pride had built his fortress, and now it was cracking from within. When she finally gathered the courage to drive to Seattle, she found the Vertex Systems Tower eerily quiet. Security was light, the lobby nearly empty. She asked for Daniel and was told he was in a closed meeting. She waited in the atrium, staring up at the company logo gleaming against the marble wall. It struck her that it looked the same as when Ethan ruled it. Only the nameplate had changed. Power, she realized, was just a costume men wore until it devoured them. When Daniel finally appeared, he looked thinner, his expression drawn. Grace, he said, surprised, you shouldn't be here. I had to see you. The company's falling apart. He forced a smile. The media exaggerates everything. Stop pretending. You're not saving it. You're bleeding with it. Daniel motioned toward the elevators. Not here. They stepped outside into the damp evening air. Traffic hummed around them. Grace turned to Juan. Do you even remember why you started this? He looked at her blankly. You did it to protect me, she said. But somewhere along the way, you stopped protecting and started conquering. Daniel's voice hardened. You think I wanted this war? I tried to keep control. Every move I made was to secure your name, your peace. My peace doesn't need your power, she said. It needs your humanity. The words cut through his defenses like a blade. For a moment, his composure slipped. What if I don't know how to find it anymore? He whispered. She stepped closer, then stopped running from the collapse and let it teach you. 2 weeks later, the inevitable happened. A major investor withdrew completely, triggering a wave of panic across the market. Shares plunged. The board called for an emergency vote of confidence. Grace watched the live feed from home, her hands trembling. She saw Daniel sitting at the head of the table, surrounded by silent directors. His voice was calm, deliberate, but his eyes gave him away. When the vote concluded, the chairman spoke softly. By majority decision, Mr. Bennett, the board requests your resignation effective immediately. Daniel's shoulders sank just slightly before he nodded. Understood. The feed ended. Grace pressed a hand to her chest, half in relief, half in grief. The empire had finally cracked completely. That night, Daniel returned to the vineyard. He didn't speak at first. He just stood by the window, looking out over the empty fields. Grace waited. Finally, he said, It's gone. All of it. They voted me out. I know. I thought I'd feel angry, but I don't. I just feel empty. Grace stepped beside him. That's the space where healing starts. He gave a tired laugh. You sound like someone who's forgiven the world. Not the world, she said softly. Just myself. Daniel turned to her, eyes red. Was I wrong, Grace? Tell me I was wrong. She hesitated, then nodded. You were right to fight, but wrong to forget what you were fighting for. He closed his eyes. I don't know who I am without it. Then maybe it's time to find out. In Seattle, news of Daniel's resignation spread quickly. Analysts called it the second fall of Vertex Systems. Yet amid the chaos, another headline began circulating quietly. Former CEO launches educational tech initiative for underserved schools. Ethan Cole's face reappeared, older, humbler, no longer bathed in spotlight, but in purpose. When Grace saw it, she smiled faintly. For the first time in years, the story wasn't about power or revenge or collapse. It was about renewal. Later that week, Daniel sat with her on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. He looked smaller somehow, more human. What now? He asked. Now you rest, Grace said. You let the silence teach you. He nodded slowly. And you? I'm going to paint, she said. Not from pain this time, but from gratitude. They sat together without speaking, listening to the crickets and the wind moving through the bare vines. Far away, in a modest office above a bookstore, Ethan Cole turned off his computer and looked out at the same sunset. For the first time since the night of the gala, he felt no hunger for applause, only a quiet sense that maybe, somehow, he had made peace with the ruins. The empire had cracked, but in the cracks, something alive had started to grow. The storm had passed, but its silence was heavier than thunder. The Bennett vineyard lay under a pale winter sky, vines bare and sleeping. Inside the house, Daniel sat by the fireplace, nursing a glass of wine he couldn't taste. Across from him, Grace painted in quiet concentration, her brush moving in slow, thoughtful strokes. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Daniel said, I've been offered consultancy roles, Asia, Europe. They think I can fix companies now. Grace didn't look up. You can't fix what's built on the same cracks. He gave a soft, humorless laugh. You sound like Dad. She smiled faintly. He was usually right. He turned the glass in his hand. Maybe, or maybe he was just lucky enough never to lose control. Grace rinsed her brush and met his eyes. Control was never the point, Daniel. Integrity was. He stared into the fire. I wanted to make him pay. That's all I saw. And did you? Daniel shook his head slowly. No, I made myself pay instead. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Ethan Cole's new life moved at a quieter pace. His office above the bookstore was filled with cardboard boxes, coffee mugs, and wires tangled like roots. Project Solace had grown beyond his imagination. Volunteers, teachers, and even small investors had joined. He no longer felt like a man rebuilding an empire. He felt like a man planting something that might outlive him. A journalist from a local network found him one afternoon. "Mr. Cole," she said, holding a small recorder, "you've avoided the media for over a year. Why speak now?" He hesitated, then smiled. "Because this isn't about me anymore. It's about the kids who never had a chance to build their own tools." Her next question was softer. "Do you miss the spotlight?" He thought for a long moment. "Spotlights burn," he said finally, "but sunlight grows things." The clip went viral, not as a scandal, but as something people needed to hear. For the first time, Ethan's name trended not for ego or failure, but for grace. Grace saw the interview online. She replayed it 3 times. His face looked older, humbler. When he said sunlight grows things, something inside her loosened. That night, she stood on the perch under the stars and whispered, "Maybe we're all still growing." The next morning, she wrote him a letter. "Ethan, I saw what you're doing. It's good. Keep going. The world needs fewer builders of towers and more gardeners." Grace, she didn't expect an answer, but a week later one came. "Grace, your words meant more than you'll ever know. I've learned that sometimes forgiveness isn't given. It's earned through quiet work. I'm still learning." Ethan, back in Oregon, Daniel tried to disappear. The press had moved on, but whispers still followed him. He sold most of his shares, withdrew from public life, and let the vineyard become his refuge. Grace watched him fade between the vines like a ghost of ambition. One afternoon, she found him repairing a fence in the cold wind. "You don't have to punish yourself," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I need to. Maybe it's the only way to understand what I took from him. And from you." Grace stepped closer. "You protected me, Daniel. But you forgot that vengeance doesn't protect, it imprisons." He met her gaze, eyes raw. "I didn't know how to stop." "You stopped by choosing something else." He frowned. "Like what?" She handed him an envelope. "Ethan's project, Project Solace. He's helping schools rebuild their tech programs. They need investors." Daniel looked at her, stunned. "You're serious?" "Yes, it's not about him. It's about what we all lost trying to win." He turned the envelope over in his hands, as if it might burn him. "You think he'd accept my help?" Grace smiled softly. "That's his test, not yours." A month later, Ethan was reviewing donation reports when his assistant entered. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's important." He looked up and froze. Daniel Bennett stood in the doorway, no suit, no entourage, just a man carrying an unspoken weight. Ethan rose slowly. "I didn't expect this." Daniel nodded. "Neither did I." They stood in silence, the hum of the old heater the only sound. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Grace told me about your project. It's good work." Ethan's expression was guarded. "Why are you here?" "To help," Daniel said simply. "Not to own, not to control, just to help." Ethan crossed his arms. "Why now?" Daniel met his eyes. "Because I finally understand what I destroyed when I thought I was saving her." The words hung between them. Ethan exhaled, a slow release of years of bitterness. "You didn't destroy me, Daniel. I did that myself." Daniel hesitated. "Maybe we both did." Ethan studied him for a long time, then gestured toward the files on the desk. "Sit down. Let's see if we can build something that isn't made of glass this time." Over the next months, the two men worked quietly together. No cameras, no speeches. Project Solace grew from a regional initiative into a national network. Daniel managed logistics. Ethan focused on vision. Where one was analytical, the other was instinctive. For the first time, their strengths didn't clash. They completed each other's gaps. Grace visited occasionally, bringing sketches for the program's art outreach branch. Watching them talk, she saw something she hadn't thought possible. Two men once defined by pride, now bound by purpose. One evening, as the three of them shared dinner in Ethan's modest office, Grace said, "It's strange. The world remembers the collapse, not the rebuilding." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe that's how it should be. People need cautionary tales more than happy endings." Daniel shook his head. "No, they need both. One to warn them, the other to give them hope." Grace raised her glass. "Then here's to both." They clinked glasses, the sound small but resolute, like the beginning of forgiveness. Months passed. Project Solace appeared on national television, not as a redemption story, but as a human one. A clip showed Ethan speaking to a group of children as Daniel watched from the crowd, unseen. Grace stood beside them, smiling. When the interviewer asked Ethan what drove him now, he said simply, "Failure taught me what success never could. It's not about how high you climb, it's about what you lift when you fall." That night, Daniel turned to Grace and whispered, "He's found peace." She nodded. "So can you." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe I already have." Years later, the vineyard thrived again. Grace ran an art foundation for local youth. Daniel served as a quiet donor for Ethan's program. The public had long moved on to new scandals, new empires. But sometimes, when the three of them crossed paths at charity events, there was no bitterness, only recognition. A shared history too deep for resentment. Ethan once said during a private toast, "We built towers, tore them down, and somehow planted something better in their place." Grace replied softly, "Fire burns, but it also forges." And Daniel added, "Maybe redemption isn't a destination. Maybe it's a daily choice." The three glasses touched gently. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the world in a golden light that felt finally like peace. Spring came to Oregon with soft rain and fields waking from their long sleep. The vineyard bloomed again, alive with color and the hum of work. Grace walked the rows in the early morning, her boots brushing through damp grass, the air filled with the scent of earth and renewal. It had been 3 years since the collapse. 3 years since her name had last appeared on a headline. The world had forgotten the scandal that once defined her, but she hadn't forgotten the lessons it left behind. She carried them quietly, like smooth stones in her pocket. Heavy once, now polished by time. Inside the farmhouse, Daniel read the newspaper. The headline on the business page made him smile faintly. "Project Solace expands to 50 states." Under the photo of Ethan Cole shaking hands with teachers, a smaller line read, "Supported by Bennett Foundation grants." Grace poured coffee and set it beside him. "Still reading about work?" Daniel looked up, tired but softer than he'd been in years. "It's not work anymore. It's something that makes sense." She sat across from him. "You look at peace," he nodded. "Some mornings I almost believe I am." Grace studied him for a moment. "Do you ever think about seeing him? In person, I mean?" Daniel's smile faded. "Ethan?" He paused, considering. "Maybe. I wouldn't know what to say." "Maybe you don't have to say anything." He folded the paper. "You sound like you've already forgiven him." "I forgave myself first," she said. The rest followed. In Seattle, Ethan Cole stood before a wall of screens in the modest headquarters of Project Solace. The program had grown faster than anyone expected. Thousands of schools now had computers, coding labs, and mentorship programs. The work was exhausting, but it filled him with the kind of purpose no empire ever had. A young volunteer entered the room, a bright woman with a notebook full of ideas. "Mr. Cole," she said, "the board wants you to attend the conference in Portland next month. You're being honored for social innovation." Ethan smiled, almost shyly. "They should honor the teachers, not me." "They will," she said, "but they need a face. Yours works." He laughed quietly. "I used to think that was a curse." She grinned. "Maybe it's finally a gift." 2 weeks later, the Portland conference filled the city with banners and press. Ethan didn't want the attention, but he came anyway. Grace was there too, invited to exhibit her paintings at the event's art gala, a celebration of creativity and education. She didn't expect to see him, but when she entered the grand hall that evening, surrounded by warm light and laughter, she froze. Ethan stood across the room, talking with students beside a display about Project Solace. His hair was streaked with gray now, his posture humbler, his smile unguarded. For a moment, time folded. The years between the gala, where everything had fallen apart, and this quiet evening of renewal blurred into one. He noticed her before she could turn away. Their eyes met. Ethan excused himself gently from the students and walked toward her. Every step felt like a question. "Grace," he said softly, "Ethan." They stood in the middle of the room, the buzz of conversation fading into a low hum around them. "It's been a long time," he said. 3 years. He nodded. "You look happy." "I am," she said honestly. "You look like a man who finally learned how to breathe." That made him laugh quietly, almost gratefully. I suppose I did. They stood in silence again. Grace gestured toward the exhibit. I saw your work. It's good. It's not mine anymore, Ethan said. It belongs to the people who believed when I didn't. Her eyes softened. That sounds like something I once said to you. He smiled. It's something I finally understood. Before they could say more, Daniel entered the room. His arrival drew whispers. Some people still recognized him, though his name had faded from the front pages. When he saw them together, he hesitated. Then after a moment, he walked over. Ethan, Daniel said, extending his hand. It's been a while. Ethan took it, steady and unflinching. Too long. Daniel looked at him closely, as if searching for the arrogance that used to live behind those eyes. He found none. You've changed, he said. So have you. The two men stood in the quiet recognition of everything they'd done to and for each other. Daniel broke the silence first. The program is good, and I'm glad I invested. You didn't invest, Ethan said gently. You believed. There's a difference. Grace watched them, emotions swelling in her chest. It wasn't reconciliation in the dramatic sense. No apologies, no grand speeches, but something deeper. The silent understanding of two men who had both fallen and somehow chosen to rise again. Would you both like to see the new exhibition? She asked finally, breaking the tension. They followed her through the gallery. One painting stopped them all, a sweeping landscape of the vineyard at sunrise, golden light spilling through broken clouds. The title read, The Light That Remained. Ethan stood in front of it for a long time. You painted this after it all ended? Grace nodded. After everything broke. But I realized the light never left. It just changed direction. Daniel's voice was low. That's what redemption is, isn't it? Not going back, but turning toward what's still bright. Grace smiled. Exactly. Later that night, the three of them walked along the riverside outside the hotel. The city lights shimmered on the water. Ethan spoke first. I used to think redemption was something you earned by winning again. Now I know it's something you live quietly, every day. Daniel nodded. And forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened. It's about not letting it define you. Grace stopped and looked at both of them. Maybe that's all we ever needed, to stop trying to rewrite the past and just start writing the next chapter. Ethan smiled at her. Then this is yours to begin. She shook her head. No, ours, all of us. They stood together in the cool night air, the silence no longer heavy but whole. Somewhere behind them, the city buzzed with life, unaware that three people once broken by pride had quietly found peace. Months later, Project Solace hosted its first national summit. Grace's foundation partnered with the program, integrating art and technology for children across the country. Daniel served as financial advisor, his name absent from the spotlight by choice. At the closing ceremony, Ethan spoke before a crowd of educators and families. His voice was calm, sure, human. When we began, he said, this was just an idea. But ideas don't change the world. People do. People who believe that mistakes aren't endings, that broken things can still build bridges. He looked toward Grace and Daniel in the front row. We've all fallen, some of us from higher places than others. But what matters isn't the fall, it's the hands we reach for when we rise. The audience stood in applause. Cameras flashed, but for once the light didn't blind him. It warmed him. That evening after the event, they returned to the vineyard together. The air was soft with the hum of crickets. The vines shimmered under the moonlight. Ethan looked across the field and said quietly, when I lost everything, I thought it was punishment. Now I think it was a gift. I had to lose my world to find the one that mattered. Daniel smiled faintly. Then maybe we all got what we needed. Grace nodded. We did. We just had to walk through fire to see it. They stood there for a long time, three silhouettes against the silver fields. The night was silent but alive, carrying the faint scent of rain and forgiveness. For the first time in years, none of them felt the need to speak. The world had turned, and they had turned with it, away from the ruin, toward the quiet, steady light that had been waiting all along. The vineyard had become a sanctuary of sunlight and stillness. Years had passed since the chaos, but for Grace Bennett, time no longer felt linear. It flowed like the wind through the vines, circling, whispering, forgiving. She lived quietly now, surrounded by color and the soft hum of creation. Her art foundation had flourished, connecting rural schools to programs that fuse painting with technology in partnership with Project Solace. Ethan Cole visited often. He preferred not to be recognized anymore, though his face still appeared in quiet profiles about leadership and redemption. "You're the only interview I ever look forward to," he once joked, sipping coffee on Grace's porch. Daniel, too, had changed. He had learned to live without the hunger for control. He still worked in finance, but only to support causes that built rather than conquered. When Grace teased him about mellowing, he'd laugh. "I used to think peace was boring. Turns out it's harder work than war." But peace, like the seasons, never stays still. One spring morning, Ethan arrived at the vineyard unannounced, his car coated in dust from the long drive. Grace was in the garden, pruning roses. When she saw his face, she knew something was wrong. "Ethan?" He smiled faintly. "You always know." "Sit down," she said. "Tell me." He hesitated, looking out at the distant hills. "I had my yearly checkup. The doctors found something. Nothing immediate, but something." Grace's hands froze. "How serious?" "They say I have time," he said quietly. "A few years, maybe more. But it's a reminder." "A reminder of what?" He looked at her then, his eyes calm and unbearably kind. "That I spent the first half of my life building things that didn't matter, and the second half trying to build something that did. I don't want Project Solace to depend on me. It has to outlive us all." Grace felt her throat tighten. "It already will." He smiled. "Not unless we make sure." Over the next few months, Ethan, Grace, and Daniel met often, sketching plans for Solace's future, expanding leadership, training new directors, securing funding that couldn't be corrupted. It felt like the early days again, when purpose came before pride. But beneath the work, there was an unspoken awareness that this was a farewell written in slow motion. Daniel pretended not to see Ethan's growing fatigue, but Grace noticed the slower steps, the occasional tremor in his hand. Still, Ethan never complained. He worked with quiet joy, as if every day was a gift already unwrapped. One evening, after a long strategy meeting, the three of them sat under the stars with glasses of wine. Daniel broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder how different it could have been if we hadn't destroyed each other first?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Then we'd probably still be miserable." Grace laughed softly, the sound warm and free. "Pain was the only language we knew back then. Maybe this was the only translation that could save us." Daniel raised his glass. "To bad beginnings." Ethan clinked his lightly. "And better endings." A year passed. Project Solace reached international scale. Schools in Kenya, India, and South America now received refurbished technology through the network. Media outlets praised the initiative, calling it a blueprint for modern redemption. But Ethan refused interviews. "It's not my story anymore," he said. He spent more time at the vineyard, helping Grace's students learn basic coding between painting lessons. Watching the children laugh filled him with quiet wonder. One afternoon, a young boy asked him, "Were you ever famous?" Ethan chuckled. "Once, it didn't go well." "What did you do?" the boy asked. "I forgot what mattered." "And now?" He smiled. "Now I remember." By autumn, his health began to decline. Grace tried to hide her worry, but Daniel saw it too. They took turns visiting him in Seattle, where he insisted on staying in his small apartment overlooking the Sound. The place was filled with photos, not of boardrooms or awards, but of schools and children smiling beside rows of donated computers. One evening, Daniel arrived to find Ethan working at his desk, pale but focused. "You should rest," Daniel said. Ethan looked up with a wry smile. "I've been resting my whole life when I should have been living. I'm catching up." Daniel sat across from him. "You know, I used to think you were my enemy." Ethan nodded. "I was. You were right to take me down." "No," Daniel said softly. "I was right to protect Grace. But I went too far. I turned justice into obsession." Ethan leaned back, his eyes kind. "Maybe obsession is just what justice looks like when it's hurting." They sat in silence, the kind that only men who had seen the worst of themselves could share. When Daniel left that night, Ethan said, "If I don't make it to next spring, tell Grace, tell her I never stopped being grateful she believed in me, even when she didn't." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. You'll tell her yourself. Ethan smiled. Maybe. The next spring, the vineyard bloomed earlier than usual. Grace walked the rows alone one morning and felt a strange stillness in the air. A few hours later, the phone rang. Ethan Cole had passed peacefully in his sleep. She didn't cry at first. She sat on the porch, staring at the sky, listening to the wind move through the vines. It was only when she looked toward the easel in her studio, where a half-finished painting of the sunrise waited, that the tears came. Daniel found her there later, silent and pale. He knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. He went quietly, she whispered, like he always wanted. Daniel nodded. He left a letter. He handed her a sealed envelope. Her name was written in Ethan's familiar, careful script. She opened it with trembling hands. Grace, if you're reading this, it means I finally learned how to let go. Don't mourn me. I had more years of peace than I deserved. Thank you for showing me that love doesn't always have to be romantic. It can be redemptive. Keep painting. Keep growing. Tell Daniel that the world still needs quiet protectors like him. And remember, we don't get to choose the light we leave behind, only that we leave some. Grace read it twice, then folded it carefully and pressed it to her heart. Months later, she stood before a crowd at Project Solace's 10th anniversary gala. The program now bore a new name, the Cole Bennett Foundation for Digital Literacy and the Arts. As she took the stage, Daniel watched from the front row, pride and grief mixing in equal measure. Grace spoke simply. We started this to rebuild what ambition destroyed, but what grew was bigger than any of us. Ethan taught us that forgiveness can be an act of creation. Every computer donated, every child who learns to dream, those are brushstrokes in a larger painting, one we're still finishing together. The audience stood in applause, but Grace didn't see the cameras or the lights. She only saw Ethan's smile in memory and the vineyard's sunlight filtering through glass. When she stepped off stage, Daniel whispered, he'd be proud. She nodded. He already is. That evening, back at the vineyard, she walked outside with the lantern. The vines shimmered gold under the moon. She stopped near the oldest tree on the property where they'd buried a small box. Ethan's letters, his sketches for Project Solace, a few photos. Grace placed the lantern beside it and whispered, You found the light, Ethan. And it stayed. As the wind moved through the leaves, she closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere in the soft rustle of branches, she thought she heard his voice, not in words but in peace. And for the first time since that long-ago night of humiliation, Grace Bennett felt no weight, no anger, no grief, only gratitude for every broken thing that had led her here. The summer after Ethan's passing was the gentlest Grace could remember. The vineyard thrived beneath a sky so blue it seemed endless. Children from her foundation ran through the rows during workshops, their laughter drifting like music. She often thought Ethan would have loved this season. Alive, honest, simple. Daniel came by more often now, sleeves rolled, helping her repair fences or carry easels to the barn for classes. The sharp edges that had once defined him had softened. He still spoke little, but when he did, his words carried warmth instead of command. One evening after the children had gone home and the sun bled orange across the hills, Grace poured 2 glasses of wine and joined him on the porch. The old wooden boards creaked beneath their chairs. Do you ever think about him? She asked. Daniel looked out at the vines. Every day. He paused. But it doesn't hurt the way it used to. It feels like remembering an old song. Grace smiled. He'd like that. He was always trying to rewrite the melody. Daniel chuckled. And we kept changing the tempo. They sat in easy silence, watching the fireflies begin to appear. In the city, the Cole Bennett Foundation continued to grow. Newspapers occasionally ran stories about its global reach, how small villages now had computer labs, how young artists were using tech to tell stories that mattered. Grace read them, but never framed the articles. The success wasn't what filled her. It was the letters from students. Thank you for helping me paint my first mural. Thank you for showing me I could code. Sometimes she'd open her email and find new messages forwarded from the foundation's team, teachers sending photos of classrooms painted in soft blue, each wall inscribed with the same quote Ethan had once written on a whiteboard. We don't get to choose the light we leave behind, only that we leave some. She'd stare at those words and whisper, You left plenty. By late August, the vineyard prepared for harvest. Grace walked the rows one morning and found Daniel standing by the old oak tree, the one beneath which Ethan's letters were buried. He was holding a small wooden box. "What's that?" she asked. He smiled. "A time capsule for the next generation of the foundation." He knelt and placed it beside the tree. Inside were three things: one of Ethan's sketches, a photo of the three of them from the early years of Project Solace, and a handwritten note that read, "We built this out of failure, forgiveness, and faith. If you find this, remember, build slow, love fast, and never mistake pride for purpose." Grace felt tears blur her vision. "You've become a poet." Daniel shook his head. "Just a man who finally learned how to listen." That evening, the sky turned violet and gold. Grace hosted a small dinner for her art students, many of whom had never seen the stars so clearly. They ate under the open sky, laughter rising with the scent of grapes and cedar. Daniel played the old record player softly, a jazz tune Ethan used to hum absent-mindedly. When the music ended, Grace raised her glass. "To what was lost," she said, "and to everything that grew in its place." Daniel lifted his. "To the quiet kind of love, the one that doesn't shout, but stays." The students followed suit, glasses clinking in the fading light. Grace looked around the table. Faces young and hopeful, faces that had never known the arrogance or pain that once ruled their own lives, and felt something sacred stir inside her. This, she thought, is legacy. Not the empires built on ego, but the laughter of those who inherit peace. Later, when the guests had gone and the vineyard lay quiet, Grace walked to her studio. On the easel stood a new canvas, the silhouette of the vineyard under starlight, three faint figures in the distance, one walking ahead, two standing side by side. She added a final stroke of light across the horizon and stepped back. The painting she titled Homecoming. Outside, the night wind carried the scent of summer and the memory of every voice that had once filled this land. Grace closed her eyes and whispered into the stillness, "You can rest now, Ethan. We'll keep the light burning." Then she blew out the lamp, and the vineyard settled into darkness, soft, forgiving, and forever alive. Autumn returned to the valley with golden patience. The vines shimmered with fruit, and the hills carried that faint, smoky perfume of harvest. Grace had grown older, her hair now a silver braid that caught the morning light, but her eyes still held the same steady calm that had carried her through ruin and resurrection. The vineyard had become more than a home. It was a sanctuary for creation. Children still came every season for art and technology workshops, though now most of them came from far beyond Oregon. Some spoke Spanish, some Swahili, some only the quiet language of wonder. Grace loved them all the same. Daniel had moved into the guest cottage 2 years before. His heart had given him trouble, and city life no longer suited him. He managed the foundation's investments from a small desk overlooking the vineyard. Each morning she'd find him there, reading reports, humming softly, sometimes smiling to himself as though finally content with the balance sheet of his soul. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked one morning as she brought him tea. "Miss what?" "The rush, the power." He looked up, eyes crinkling with amusement. "No, I finally figured out power's just alone. Peace, though, that you can own outright." Grace laughed, the sound like wind through the vines. That year, the foundation announced a global initiative in Ethan Cole's name, the Solace Scholars Program, offering grants to young innovators working at the crossroads of art, education, and technology. The press called it a legacy of light. Grace attended the ceremony, though she preferred to stay at the edge of the crowd. A young woman named Emily Carter received the first fellowship. Nervous and radiant, she gave a speech that made Grace's heart ache in the best way. "When I was a child," Emily said, "our school got its first computers from the Cole Bennett Foundation. I used one to learn design. I'm here because someone I never met believed I could be more than my circumstances." Grace clapped quietly, tears blurring her vision. Beside her, Daniel whispered, "He'd be proud." Wish Grace nodded. "He already is. You can feel it in the room." Later, back at the vineyard, Grace found a letter waiting in her studio. It had been mailed from a small coastal town in Washington. Inside was a single page in familiar handwriting. Daniel's. "Grace, if you're reading this, I've gone before you. Don't grieve. I've had enough second chances to fill a lifetime. The vineyard is yours now, though I suspect it always was. Keep the kids laughing. Keep the lights burning. And when you think of me, think of quiet mornings, not headlines. D. She sat for a long while after reading it, the paper trembling in her hand. Outside, the wind moved gently through the vines, as though carrying his farewell on every rustle of leaf. That evening, she walked to the oak tree, their sacred ground, and placed the letter beside Ethan's. Two lives once consumed by pride, now resting together beneath roots that ran deep and true. She whispered, "You both found your peace. Thank you for teaching me mine." Winter came with its soft silence. Grace no longer painted for galleries. She painted for herself. Each canvas became a memory of something larger than any one life. The shimmer of rain on grapes, the way sunlight curved across the hills, the laughter of children coding beneath oak trees. Her favorite painting, though, remained Homecoming. It hung in her study, and every morning she would light a candle beneath it before beginning her day. One afternoon, Emily Carter visited the vineyard, now a rising leader within the foundation. "You've built something that will outlive us all," she said, looking around in awe. Grace smiled. "We all built it. I just kept the soil warm." Emily hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever regret how it all started? The pain, the scandal?" Grace gazed out the window. The vines glowed in the late light, endless and alive. "No," she said softly. "Sometimes you have to break to let the light in. The trick is remembering what to grow afterward." Emily nodded, understanding more than words could say. That night, Grace sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, listening to the symphony of crickets and distant laughter. The stars were impossibly bright. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the gentle rhythm of everything she had loved and lost. Ethan's voice, Daniel's dry humor, the steady heartbeat of purpose that had outlasted all the noise. She closed her eyes and whispered into the night, "We did it. We turned the ruin into roots." The wind stirred softly in reply, carrying the scent of ripened grapes and summer's memory. Grace smiled, letting the sound fill her lungs like prayer. For the first time in her life, she felt truly complete. Not because she had won, but because she had endured, rebuilt, forgiven. The vineyard stretched before her like a promise, endless and gold beneath the stars. And when the candle in her study flickered out hours later, it wasn't darkness that filled the room, but the quiet, abiding light that remained. The final harvest came early that year, beneath a September sky that glowed like honey. The vines hung heavy with fruit, their scent rich and heady in the warm air. Grace Bennett stood at the edge of the field, watching the workers move through the rows with laughter and songs. The rhythm of the shears, the rustle of leaves, it all sounded like time breathing. She was 70 now. Her hands were slower, her hair white as the mist that rolled in from the hills each morning. Yet her spirit felt untouched by age. The vineyard had become a living memory, a testament not to success, but to endurance. Children of former students now visited each summer to learn painting and coding under the same trees their parents once played beneath. Everywhere Grace looked, life had carried on. That evening, she hosted the traditional harvest dinner beneath the lanterns strung across the courtyard. Alumni from the Cole Bennett Foundation came from across the country, teachers, artists, engineers. There was laughter, stories, and the warm hum of belonging. When the meal ended, someone raised a glass. "To Grace," a young man said, "for showing us that forgiveness is a form of creation." The others cheered softly, glasses raised high. Grace smiled, humbled. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "But you're the real proof that all this was worth it. We planted hope in broken ground, and look how it grew." The crowd clapped again, and she looked across the tables, her gaze catching on the younger faces, the ones who hadn't lived through the fall but inherited its lessons. She thought of Ethan, of Daniel, how their stories had become soil for this harvest. When the music began, she slipped away unnoticed, walking into the vineyard. The night was cool and silver. Above her, the stars shimmered like scattered memory. At the oak tree, she stopped. The air was still, the moonlight falling soft on the ground. The small markers were still there, weathered but steady. She knelt slowly, tracing the faint engravings with her fingertips. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "The lights never went out." She sat there for a long while, her breathing calm, her heart full. The crickets sang around her like a lullaby. Then she took out a folded letter, her own this time, and placed it inside the wooden box beside the others. To whoever finds this, we began as ambition, we broke in pride, and we were remade in forgiveness. This land holds our story, the cost of forgetting what matters and the grace of remembering again. If you read this, plant something, anything, grow what endures. Grace Bennett, she closed the lid gently, the gesture both farewell and blessing. The next morning, the workers found her asleep on the porch, the sunrise spilling gold across her face. She was smiling. A soft, knowing peace settled around her. The newspaper on the table beside her carried a headline she'd have loved. Cole Bennett Foundation opens new global campus, dedicated to the spirit of creation. In the years that followed, the vineyard became a retreat for artists and educators. Visitors would come to walk the rows, to read the stories carved into the old oak, to feel the quiet that seemed to hum with memory. They said the place carried an energy, gentle, wise, eternal. And when they asked who had built it, the caretakers always gave the same answer: a man who fell, a brother who forgave, and a woman who kept the light. One summer decades later, a child ran through the vines chasing fireflies, laughing as her parents called after her. She stopped at the oak tree and saw the weathered box, half buried in earth. Curious, she brushed away the soil and opened it. Inside were letters, sketches, and a photo of three people smiling beneath the sun. She couldn't read all the words yet, but she traced the final one on the paper, written in faded ink. Light. The girl looked up at the sky, wide-eyed. The evening breeze swept through the vines, carrying the scent of grapes and something older. Something like gratitude. In that moment, the story began again. Grace Bennett had once believed the world ended with loss, but the vineyard proved otherwise. Everything she'd loved had changed form, but never disappeared. It lived on in laughter, in learning, in light. And so the vineyard remained, timeless under the Oregon sky, its rows stretching toward the horizon like lines of a prayer whispered by the earth itself. Where pride once burned, peace now bloomed. Where vengeance once ruled, forgiveness had taken root. And where darkness once seemed endless, the light endured.